This video is now in session, and the US Census Bureau last Thursday on August 12th released additional set of data pertaining to the 2020 US Census count, and the individuals who are counted, their racial background, their economic background, among other factors. And today, we're going to take a look at racial factors from the 2020 US Census, and as well as population changes, more specific population changes than just congressional reapportionment. So, as you can see here in this map, this shows every single county of the United States, and counties that shift to the right show places with more people of color in that county compared to 2010 during that census. And if the arrow goes to the left, that means there are more white people in that county than compared to 2010. And as you can see here, the map is almost completely filled with arrows pointing towards the right, and it generally shows that the United States is becoming a more diverse nation. You can see here that the population makeup between 2010 and 2020 heavily changed during this decade, with the white population going down all the way to 57%, around 57%. Meanwhile, the biggest growth of a single race in this period was the Hispanic coalition. They increased by a large percentage, and now they are the dominant minority out of the major minorities, Asian, Hispanic, and as well as Black Americans. You can also see here that Asians also grew larger compared to 2010 by a pretty big amount. You can see that they started off here and now they're over here. They take up a much larger percentage. In addition, those with multiple races have also grown. You can see that this gray spot right here has grown significantly from 2010 to 2020 in terms of a percentage change. So with that, the white coalition is set to become a minority soon, maybe even the next decade, based on population trends, based on previous directions of the 2010, 2000, and 2020 censuses. If this trend continues, then by 2030 or by 2040, white Americans will no longer become the majority in the United States. It would be a majority-minority coalition that would become the dominant force in the United States. And all of this, in some ways, is good for both Republicans and Democrats. In the short term, this is good for Republicans, but in the long term, unless Republicans change their campaign strategy, this is good for Democrats. And the reason why it's good for Democrats is because if we look at, it's not unsurprising to see how this is good for Democrats, which is because minorities typically vote in larger margins for the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. But the reason why this is good in the short term for the Republican Party is because we need to see where this growth is happening. This growth is happening in the southern and the southwest regions of the United States, in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, in Atlanta, Orlando, as well as Austin, San Antonio, Phoenix. All of these locations are having higher percentages of minorities, and overall they're having a much larger population compared to 2010, which bodes well for them in the short term because they have additional population, which gives them more electoral votes. But in the long term, many of these groups that are increasing are consistent with voting for the Democratic Party. The Asian coalition, many of them vote for the Democratic Party. The Hispanic coalition, many of them as well. And a lot of the Black coalition votes for the Democratic Party. So with that, you have an increase in all of these groups over many of these cities in increasingly competitive states. So in the long term, when these groups keep going, we can expect that the Democrats will do well in these states. If we talk about some of them, they're like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona. These states are among the fastest growing states in the nation, in addition with Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and Idaho. But the main states that you need to focus on, or that we need to focus on, is Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. So in each of these states, there are younger individuals coming into these states. There are more diverse coalitions in each of these cities, in Dallas, in Houston, in Phoenix, in Orlando, in Atlanta, and in the Raleigh-Durham area. And with these places, we can examine each of them separately. If we talk about Arizona and the Phoenix metro area, the Phoenix metro area in the 2020 census has just overtaken Philadelphia as the 5th largest city in the United States, which is a humongous growth from just 2 decades prior, where Phoenix wasn't really that big of a city at all. In the Dallas area, we're seeing a huge influx of Asian Americans in the region between 2010, which is right here, and 2020. They increased more than 75%. And even though they rose by the similar margins to the Black coalition, to Black Americans, there are way more Black Americans than Asian Americans in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which means that their growth is actually pretty large. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there are a bunch of tech companies coming over, there are a bunch of young people coming over, and there has been a bunch of Asian Americans in Texas. So if we look at the state of Texas, you won't really expect it to be a state where there are a lot of Asian Americans, but if we look overall, nationally speaking, Texas is one of the biggest states in terms of Asian American population. If we see in the Dallas area and in the Houston area, both of them have rising Asian populations, both in Collin County, which is just north of Dallas, and as well as Sugar Land, which is just southwest of Houston. Both of those locations are having incredibly high margins of Asian Americans in that area. So that is helping to fuel the growth of Texas, along with individuals moving from other states like California and New York. And that's why a lot of people say that Texas will eventually turn blue. And at this pace, it does seem like Texas will turn blue. It's only a question of time, and this can only change if Republicans change their campaign strategy, because we've seen since the 2000 election, Texas has moved more and more towards the Democrats in each presidential election. And it's following a similar trend to California. California used to be a ruby red Republican state, the state of Nixon, the state of Ronald Reagan. But as Ronald Reagan advanced to his presidential election, I guess his re-election, California started moving more towards the Democratic side, and the reason why was because of Hispanics, because of Latino Americans who wanted their issues represented and accurately represented. Because we saw a proposition happen in California a few decades ago, after Ronald Reagan was president. We saw a proposition that would have restricted immigration, that would have restricted border entries from Mexico over to the United States, and a lot of Californians were unhappy of that, and it was mostly fueled by the Hispanic coalition, and because of that, that kind of plan was suggested by the Republican Party, and thus the Republican Party started to have a setback in California, and that was how Democrats were able to take over the state, and that's why California is one of the most democratic states in the union, and that's something that could happen in Texas. We're seeing the same kind of the same kind of ingredients that we saw from California. We're seeing a rise in issues of immigration and as well as Latino culture, and in addition, issues that many Hispanics in Texas aren't necessarily too happy about with the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party has somewhat learned from California and that lesson, because they've realized, or at least some Republicans in Texas have realized, that if they simply focus on economical issues, if they're fiscally conservative, then a lot of Latinos would agree with them, especially in the Rio Grande Valley, where there are a lot of Latinos working as as blue collar workers are immigration enforcement individuals, and because of that, they are more sincere to the Republican Party. But if the Republican Party moves more socially conservative, like we're seeing right now, and moves more towards right-wing politics, then that's going to put them at risk. And we saw this in California, where right-wing politics essentially destroyed the Republican Party. Right-wing politics is certainly harming Texas Republicans. If we're talking about the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, he's very divisive as a governor, and a lot of Texans, especially swing Texan voters, are unhappy that Governor Greg Abbott is going to such extreme lengths of conservatism. Now, does that mean that he would lose the 2022 election? That certainly doesn't. But what it does mean is that it makes an election more competitive, but it also starts to make people question. It starts to make people question whether or not they want to continue to vote for the Republican Party, or if they want to switch parties, and that's something very similar to California. But for the Republican Party, they have started to think about this more. They've started to think about this more properly, because we are seeing such a big demographic shift from the Northeast to the South, and because we're seeing such a big influx of Hispanics in the Sun Belt region. A lot of Republicans are at risk, and they realize that. So a lot of time, for the Republican Party, there's starting to be a divide when it comes to Hispanic related issues like immigration. Immigration is an issue that is starting to divide the Republican Party. Even though we have state Republican politicians like Texas that are actively closing the border, we have other states like Florida that are okay with immigration, that are expanding the ways you can immigrate from Central America, South America, and the Caribbean over to Florida. And that's because of the Republican Party wanting to get the Hispanic votes. Because it is important to get that crucial block. The Hispanic voting block, which technically isn't a homogenous voting block, but the Hispanic coalition will be the most important coalition, will be the most important ethnicity for the next few presidential elections. Starting from 2028, we could see the Hispanic we can see the Hispanic coalition become the dominant force in politics, and that's because of competitive states like Texas, Arizona, and Florida, and Georgia, because these states are growing in electoral presence, while this traditional competitive states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, they're all losing electorally in future presidential elections, because there are more people moving out of these states than there are more people moving out of these states, and there are less people moving in than a lot of these Sunbelt states. So the Democrats are starting to focus their strategy on the Sunbelt region to get voter registration drives, and you can see in the 2020 election, Joe Biden was able to flip 2 of the Sunbelt states. So for the Democrats, they're actively positioning their offense for the Sun Belt. Meanwhile, for the Republican Party, they have to get the Hispanic coalition. If they do not get the Hispanic coalition, they will not be able to win in Senate elections, they won't be able to win in presidential elections, and they might not even be able to win in House elections in future elections in the long term. So that's the state of play right now. This is what the census has shown us, and based on these population changes that you can see right here, you can see that Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, all of these Sunbelt states are growing in population, and the main driver of this growth is Hispanics, Asians, and young individuals. All demographics are more likely at this moment to vote for the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. And with that, even though it might help the Republicans in the short term, electorally speaking, with states like Texas not being ultra competitive as of the moment, as of right now, in the long term, though, the Democrats are definitely faring off better, because a lot of these states will get more competitive as more people start to move into these states, and as these states get more diverse. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.